Well, I heard that a professor in one of our large universities asked a member of the junior class to tell him the principal cause of divorce. And with that wisdom, which is far beyond his years, the young man answered, marriage. And you really can't say he wasn't just exactly right. But I'm sure it's not the answer that was expected. Actually, if we look upon life for what it really is, a training school, a place where we're supposed to learn something, then when great groups of people, nations, do not learn, they are in trouble. When individuals do not learn, their difficulties multiply. And of all difficulties for human beings, human relationships are the most complex and difficult. We probably do not always realize this and have a kind of optimism that we can go through a complete lifetime in comparative ease. Well, a few make it. But for the majority, life becomes a series of decisions. Not that they are in themselves tragic, though they are difficult, but they are decisions that call upon resources within ourselves, resources that we do not like to be forced to use. We do not like to accept pain, sorrow, loss, separation, infidelity, or any of these relationships of life which test the caliber of individuals. Also, we are divided in our allegiances always by that great separation which was for thousands of years called the church and the state. Now, the church today is simply a term which we can apply to the problems of the inner life of the individual, and the state applies to his external and environmental difficulties. Therefore, we all live on a two-level code. A code from the outside which forces decisions upon us, and a code from the inside which is supposed to provide us with ideals and incentives by means of which we can bear with dignity the problems of the outside world. Many people are not equipped for this, and it is difficult and unhappy to say that in the last 50 years the strength of the inner code has diminished for most people. We are no longer dominated by what might be termed traditional rules, nor is the church strong enough to demand allegiance to various moral codes which have been presented to the world over the period of thousands of years. The individual, trying to adjust to the environment, sacrifices the integrities of his inner life. And if he tries to live according to the inner life, he runs into confusion and conflict in the environmental world. So we are all torn between ideals and what we like to think of as realities. Realities, however, are merely temporary, passing conditions of society. But realities go on forever. Thus we have to really consider what happens to people. Why is it that the divorce rate is increasing, and that laws and rules are being made every day which cater primarily to escape mechanisms? We do not wish to be forced into a head-on collision with either society or our own inner conscience. To avoid or evade these responsibilities of decision, we have to call upon resources. What resources does the average person of today, especially the younger person, have to fall back on in an emotional or mental emergency? What background have we built to maintain life, to maintain those things and values which make life significant, meaningful, useful, and practical? Well, most young people today have not had training in what Comenius called the mother school. The mother, in turn, is in a state of personal emotional tension and confusion. The inside of the person, dominated by environmental pressures, develops fatigues and gradually lowers the level of dispositional controls. So the family today is made up very largely of tired, tense, worried, frightened people. And children coming into this environment gain very little of basic integrities. In many homes, of course, efforts are definitely made to take care of the moral life of the small child. Perhaps every effort is made to indoctrinate them with the religious generalities of the family. But if the child sees that the parents can't make it and are unable to live their own teaching, it is very difficult to assure the young person that the pattern is secure. It is not. Now, in addition to the generalities of the matter, we have passed through tremendous insecurities. Now, the world has always had them, and there has to be a reason why. There has to be a reason why, in the last 3,000 or 4,000 years, we have had over 8,000 large and small wars. Now, they are all the way from small attacks and defenses in the jungle to the tremendous tragedies of the present century. These conflicts appear to be the work of some great evil force, but actually they represent the fact that up to the present time, human society has never been able to keep the rules which would not make conflict necessary, or inevitable if not necessary. Actually, the world as it is not being offended or destroyed by some terrible force in space. It is simply constantly building patterns, and these patterns are so deficient that they fall apart every so many years or centuries into a great catastrophe. The answer, of course, is that we must face these things until we are willing to make the necessary changes in our own conduct. Now, many people, of course, are not aware that they can make such changes, but there is constant indoctrination in that direction. We are warned and assured that if we take the right steps, live correctly, these problems will solve themselves. But for some reason, the problems are not solved because, for some other reason, we are not living correctly. What is the matter with society in the level of family and home life? It is being battered to pieces by ambition. It is being undermined by competition. And it is also being demoralized by luxury. Someone asked a Greek philosopher if he wished to curse a man, what would he say? And the old philosopher thought for a while. Then he said, if that was to come to me, I would say to that man, may your son live in luxury. He says, that is the worst thing I can think of. Well, we got a lot of sons living in luxury these days, and many more that want to. But the fact of the matter is that the individuals and the collective's difficulties arise from ambition, selfishness, competition, and lack of discipline. Our ancestors had more discipline because life was more simple, And another factor that controlled things largely until the middle or later part of the 19th century was the power of religion. In Europe during the Middle Ages and early modern times, the religious situation was so tight that there could be very little deviation from it, except among a certain group that was regarded as impossible anyway. The same is true in this country. Our ancestors had a much more complete religious environment. They believed in it, they lived according to it to the best of their abilities, and they also rejected those who failed to conform. Now, conformity to theology is a matter today in which more and more people are objecting. But in those days when no one did object successfully, the religious background formed a kind of support, a framework, a basis upon which human society could function. The golden rules were respected. The 10 Commandments were obeyed as much as possible. And all the various elements of human relationship were strongly influenced by various religious moralities, especially in this country, the morality of Christianity. So we had certain strengths and also certain tendencies for those who tried to break away to be forced back by the environment in which they lived. They could not escape without losing the respect of their associates. Today all this has changed. But in the process of changing, we have lost necessary values along with some observances and conventionalities which were probably artificial in the beginning. So today we are more or less on our own. Religion is acceptable to those who accept it. It is not acceptable to those who do not accept it. And there is no particular stickler in society either way. The scientific mind feels rather inclined to atheism, or at least agnosticism, and considers progress to be an constantly increasing space research. The other group, religious group, is feeling a little martyred at this time, but are trying to hold on to conventions, many of which simply will not hold in this generation, because no convention will hold unless it is supported by numbers. If a large group of persons agree on something, then members of that group have mutual support. But where this is no longer true, and where religion itself is broken into all kinds of fragments, progressive and conservative, the individual stands alone. He has no major support to fall back on except himself. This being more or less the condition of things, we also find another pressure coming in, which is very largely artificial, but is desperately difficult even so, and that is economic. The problem of getting hold of money, the problem of gaining luxury through wealth, is becoming more and more obsessive. The individual comes to the conclusion that the final answer to all questions regarding his own life is success. And yet at the same time, he cannot point out very many successful people who are any happier than those with less means. The successful have their own drama and tragedy. Those less successful have not only a less intensive standard, but have greater yearnings to be of that group which is opulent. So today, whereas in the times gone by, life was lived on a reasonably conservative level, extravagance is the order of the day. Extravagance is also part of the great intensification of the industrial civilization. More and more we produce, more and more we have to find ways to sell what we produce, and still more we have to find ways of making means by which we can buy. With this tremendous economic situation hanging over on mortgages, on monthly rentals, on buying condominiums, even a successful summer ranch house or a mobile home. These things have all become immense problems. Problems that have to be faced by persons in various development patterns and also in various economic situations. One of the things, of course, that has resulted in a kind of boom in which there is more money than probably we have ever had before is due to the fact that those persons who are not in debt have a greater spending power because either their homes are paid for or they are a proprietor into a proper home situation. But where the thing continues to be unsettled and unsecure, we have the problem of pressure, how to get more money. And that is cutting into home life in a devastating way. I've moved 25, 50 years ago. Grandparents were a great asset because when the younger people wanted a little break from the pressures of home life, the parents were there as babysitters and as custodians and were recognized as valuable members of the family. Not long ago I noted an article where it stated that a babysitter for a certain family paid $5 an hour to sit for the family was one of the grandparents. $5 an hour to sit for your own granddaughter. Well, $5 is important to some people today. $5 is the difference between this and that. $5 is the way of spending $5 for something you really didn't need, but now we could get it. And little by little these things add up. Now in some cases the $5 is a vital factor. But in this angle of the situation, the family, the home, is under a certain new debit pattern. The individual who might in the older days have a whole family behind him now stands very largely alone. Another problem that is becoming very intense in this issue is the development of a very much heavier economic pattern for families. Today, if there are 3 adults in a family, they all work, or are trying to. This is a situation in which perhaps it wasn't really necessary, but it is done just the same. As a result of this, there is no one who has the freedom, the liberties, the energies, and the time to carry on those basic responsibilities for family life which God and nature have demanded. And where these family relationships are damaged or disregarded, you have a new kind of pressure. And that pressure develops, in many cases, into the broken home. Actually, the home life is no longer a very important thing in itself to many people. To some it will always be the most important. But those people are gradually dropping out, and the new generation considers the home to be basically a boarding house, a place where they come at the end of the day but give nothing to it as an emotional life experience. They come home from work, sit in front of the television, eat a television dinner which they bought in the store, and that is the evening. This type of situation is bound to lead to troubles. And the man's and the human being's basic nature requires several types of nutrition. The individual who has no inner leadership by which he can control his own appetites has very little self-respect either. Alcoholism increases, narcotic addiction increases, and these are escapes, not primarily escapes from the problems of society, but escapes from the weakness of character within the person. Where we cannot handle a problem or a responsibility without artificial stimulation or cannot live with ourselves without artificial sedation, then there is something wrong with our relation to ourselves. And this is something society cannot cure. But it is something that psychologically society is against. It is against that which interferes anytime, anywhere, and in any way with the fulfillment of our own personal desires. Now, it's wonderful to have all kinds of desires, but it is also dangerous to the person. And nature apparently gives us these kind of problems, as St. Gregory remarked many, many centuries ago. The purpose of problem is to strengthen character. And any problem that is not right, that is compromised and not solved, is going to return to haunt us. The individual must recognize that the instructional part of life does not end with high school. The individual does not gain it through the university. Education continues from the moment of birth to the moment of death. There is no break in the educational process. And there are a great many people who firmly believe that the educational process also goes on after death. Buddhists have often had this point of view, and in the Buddhist paradise, the individual does not sit around playing a harp, nor does he bask in flowery beds of ease. According to the Buddhist tradition, those who pass into the better underworlds or after-death states are sitting under trees with their teachers, learning down through the ages. Here or there, always at school. This is perhaps an interesting thought, but it has certain advantages. It is because the individual and the philosophy which he is following has also come to the conclusion that learning never ends. That learning is not something you forget the moment you get a graduation card or a diploma. Learning never ends until the lessons are learned. And because of the nature of the universe, the lessons that we still have to learn are many, and some of them difficult. Actually, therefore, in trying to solve the moment's comfort, we endanger the future of ourselves and those we care for. The attitudes that we have on living, the philosophies we try to dream up, the escape mechanisms which our neighbors are addicted to, all of these delinquencies or deficiencies represent part of the endowment of the inner life. We have to live with it. We have to overcome it. And these delinquencies we fall into, whether actually physical or merely mental and emotional, are like habits of alcoholism and narcotics. The individual who lives only to have fun is an alcoholic if he never had a drink in his life, because his attitude is the very thing that alcohol artificially seems to cause. But in reality, alcohol, as all these things that are escape mechanisms, is actually not a stimulant. It is merely a depressant of character. So this type of situation goes on, and gradually there comes into the home the beginning of responsibility. And this responsibility has a background of many different values and types and sources. Some of the responsibility is due to the fact that many persons are overeducated and underlearned. They have gone through all the matriculations that they could stand, and I know one young man now is hard at work. He's been in school so long that it's going to be wonderful and remarkable if he graduates in time for Social Security. He's already had nearly 20 years of education, and the end is not yet, because he has a couple of courses half finished and 4 more he intends to take. So this type of person has lived in a theoretical atmosphere. He has lived in a world bounded by the campuses of schools. He is gradually learning to be a completely abstract person, one who will never be able to earn anything because his specialties are not within the narrow gauge of computer specializations that we have today. His education is also so faulty in substance that he is often confused as to which of his professors is the most difficult to follow. So anyway, this process goes on until the individual, from one reason or another, decides to start out in life. Starting out in life is variously hazarded. The problems of education are falsely advanced. I remember back in the old days when I was working in New York in an insurance company, the head of the company was always in the process of interviewing some candidate for some job like office boy or assistant secretary to an assistant secretary. And when the candidate stood in front of him, my esteemed uncle looked at him very firmly. He said to him, "Are you overeducated or do you want to work?" That usually stops them. The question is not even asked anymore. It is assumed before they come that they don't intend to work. They expect to climb in a very few years to an executive position. And then they're going to make other people toe the mark. And, of course, when nations do that, we have another war. This is the way the process is run. But some young people, nice, good people, start out to try to build a world together. They start out in an atmosphere of insecurity. Both of these young people, if they decide they're going to try to get together and get married, both of them are inexperienced, not only in terms of life, but in terms of education. They are not equipped for the jobs they want. They're going to have to fight all kinds of competition to get enough and hold on to enough to have a decent personal life. This type of thing is itself nearly always a problem for compatibilities and incompatibilities. Another problem that always seems to come up in these matters is the inability of the inexperienced person to select a suitable mate to accompany them through life. It is a matter of glamour. It is a matter of a game. And it has to be played with great enthusiasm regardless of the consequences. So the marriage may start by two people who should never have married, who do not have the same interests, do not have the same integrities, but are simply looking for something else to make them happy. Happiness is the answer, not ability to create it. So these start out, and in a sense, we now have the modern picture of both young people working at some kind of a job that was going to enable them to have their apartment or something that they can afford, and they're going to start going along under a considerable glamour. Everything is very wonderful, very glamorous, and very much in the spirit of the fairy tale and the legend, the happy ever afterwards technique. Now, after a little while, it begins to become apparent that people cannot make statements or make adjustments which are not natural to them. They cannot live inconsistencies forever. And they cannot overlook each other's mistakes and limitations unless they are very, very wise people. Their money problem is still holding them. The hope and glamour of the future is strong within them. They already see themselves with a home in the mountains and a swimming pool. They are looking forward to big cars, wonderful times, long vacation, all kinds of luxuries, and they're trying desperately to the best of their ability to get to the condition where they can have these things. These things become so desperately important that they have broken millions of homes. Then along comes a further complication, the arrival of a child. Very many people cannot accept parenthood. In order to be a good parent, you have to be unselfish. The moment selfishness comes first, the home is endangered. And selfishness very often arises with the first child. The husband, who has been having complete association and control of his family life, and who is the object of the adoration of his mate, suddenly finds that she is dividing her attention between a newborn child who has constant requirements and a husband who has learned to be waited on. Crash, the thing hits a very difficult situation. Then comes something which is as artificial as any institution ever was, and that is the problem of not being able to have the necessary means and associate values to meet the gradually increasing cost of family life. There is simply no way in which the average person can face many of the debilities and problems. I know one case in which a young married couple had only been married a year and a half when the first child came, and when the child was 11 months old, it had to have a very serious brain surgery. Well, it practically broke the family. And the strain of it, the impossibility of it, unless there was very heavy unionized insurance and things of that nature, the tragedy was more than the young family could stand. Instead of glowing together in a Cinderella relationship, these two people had to devote their time for over 2 years to nothing but saving the child. Well, they were young. They had no background. They had no sense of strength. They never expected to be called upon for such an emergency. They had developed some outside interests. Now these had to be sacrificed. And little by little, what might have been a beautiful home develops into a clinic in which all the members are disturbed by one cause or another. Under this pressure, it is not unusual to find a breakup. A breakup in which sometimes the burden is too heavy for an unprepared young group, or on the other case, the expenses are too great to have any hope for future realization of dreams. Now, another factor, of course, is that the dream mechanism is getting very strong these days. There are very few people whose hope for the future is a moderate life. They want to hope that they are going to become one of those few who will be given great and unusual privileges. This situation is further glamorized or brought home by the media, by television, by various unbelievable and incredible financial conditions, in which an individual works a lifetime with hardly enough to get by, and someone else makes $5 or $10 million a year. This type of thing is completely destructive to society, and wherever the division between the people into two great groups, this division is on the basis of finance, it has ended in revolution. And it has also ended in a great breakup in families, where one person wants a quiet and moderate life, and the other demands more and more all the time. So we come finally to all and many causes by means of which marriage is broken. And in the place of marriage, we suddenly find divorce. Now, when you were married in the older days, you followed very largely the marriage ritual of the Church of England or the Catholic Church. The Protestant ritual gave us the real simple statement that we were going to live together, love, honor, and assist, till death do us part. This is now so unreasonable, so unlikely, that to make a statement of this kind and bind oneself to it as an obligation taken before God, this is more than the majority of young people will keep. The result is they break their obligation, which is the beginning of a very serious breakdown of moral structure. And if it continues the way it is going now, till death do us part will gradually fade away, as it was in the days of obey. To love, honor, and obey. Who is obeying anybody? So that has been gradually dropped without benefit of clergy into being love, honor, and assist. And in time the assist will go, then the honor will go, and then the love will go. And we will have a very empty marriage rite. Yet we do find something else, namely that the chances of a home surviving are greater if a marriage is solemnized by religion than when it is the result of the labor of a judge or a justice of the peace. The memory of a religious obligation is strong inside of the person, and very often lingers through and comes back in later years after it has been forgotten for a long time. It is something inside of the individual who wants to keep the rules, and something on the outside that says, well, if you keep the rules, you'll be poor all your life. Now, this is an inconsistency that certainly should never exist. Actually, also, let us think for a moment, these rules. Where did these great orders of rules come from? What is the origin of the Ten Commandments, or the Sermon on the Mount, or the ministrations of Paul? Where did they come from? They came from the long experience of mankind. They were gathered not directly from the tops of mountains, but in the long struggle of the individual to achieve control of his own nature, to create civilization instead of chaos in the world. He has to integrate civilization and not chaos inside himself. There isn't hardly a rule that has descended to us from the great religions of the world that is not practical. And there is hardly a single practical rule in these works which have not been broken by devout followers of that religion. The result is that we are trying to live outside of the rules. And those who are strong create tyrannies, and those who are weak are enslaved, regardless of the political structure in which they live. Everything is at sixes and sevens. And this flows in upon a very delicately balanced home life. Well, there are all kinds of attitudes that have been taken towards matters of this kind. And a considerable amount of psychiatric or psychological counseling has been successful. It helps people to realize the common ways of life that have to be followed. And probably the best of all such counseling is that which points out the tragedy of selfishness and self-interest. That the individual, to be a good member of a family, must put the good of the family above his own personal interests and desires. Otherwise, the family is in constant danger. Now, what is divorce finally going to do for the individual who has to go through it? Well, one rather intelligent woman whom I knew, around whom it is said that the Plaza Hotel in New York did all its rebuilding without interfering with the objects on her mantelpiece. This particular woman had a good family, and her husband passed on. They apparently were congenial. But she was still quite not too old in years, and everyone wondered why she didn't marry again, because she was wealthy and attractive and very well a leader in New York society and political life. So one day she told me, she said, "You know, I would rather be alone by myself than alone with someone else." This was her solution to the problem. And those who have passed through this type of tragedy, either through death of a partner or through a divorce, will probably find in the long run that there are lessons that they are going to have to learn. And to the degree that they learn these lessons, their lives will be richer. One of the things that has to happen, at least on the part of one person involved, is that they get over the indignation that may be caused, that they are not turning in hatred to the person whom they feel has damaged their lives. You've got to get hate out of it. Because as long as hate is there, nothing will be learned. And where nothing is learned, then a separation is a true disaster. It is not a disaster if everybody learns something. And this is one of the important problems. And also, in a matter of this nature, each individual should be able to maintain a decent personal feeling, each for the other. If this is impossible, then one side that cannot get this feeling is going to have to learn to get another feeling, and that is forgiveness. There cannot be any merit from a divorce if these persons separating have not learned something inside of themselves. They must examine their own lives to see to what degree they are responsible. And instead of always assuming that the other person is to blame, they have to decide as best they can where the values were and what destroyed them. The individual who gains or has a divorce to gain freedom from a responsibility that is normal and proper is making a serious mistake. An individual who is separating from another person does not come out of it a little more wise and a little more kind and a little more forgiving than before has lost one of the great opportunities of life. All of these problems have to come back to the person. And clinics today are beginning to emphasize the importance of not what happened and who was to blame, but what was learned. How did this particular occurrence fit the individual for a fuller, richer, and better life? How well did one of these persons take the responsibility of maintaining values, maintaining the proper care of children, kept right on doing the job that needed to be done? This person is the one who is growing. The individual who simply slips away because something else looks easier or the distant pastures are greener is the one who is the great loser. We are always losers when deliberately and without just cause we damage the lives of others. This is something we can't get away from. Now in the West, we are not having very much basic religious anxiety. Most individuals have only one anxiety about religion, and that is death. Oh, everything else seems as though it can be avoided or evaded. But if the individual, in the best of his ability, has lived a solid belief, it is of the greatest value to them in an emergency. One of the most terrible and painful of all forms of divorce is that which arises from religious incompatibility, where a person will spend a lifetime trying to convert the other person to his faith. And I know several cases, one in particular, in which a wife for nearly 20 years, prayed every day for hours that her husband would change his religion and accept hers. Now, a situation of this kind might be excusable, presumably, in persons of inadequate backgrounds or who had very little experience in life. But this particular family was well advanced. Both were university graduates. Both had traveled extensively. Both had worked together for years. But it finally ended in the death of the wife, who, dying, knew her husband was going to be damned forever. Now, this type of situation is something that this is an exceptional case, but there is wrangling over it. There is wrangling over a person, for instance, when two marry in the same religion, and then one changes. This is also very often a most disturbing situation, because one of the things that people have to learn in this world to live together happily is to give credit to other persons' beliefs. Let each individual believe that which is right for him or which he truly can accept. But all together they live the same code of integrities, honor, and honesty in daily living. The person whose religion makes him better has the faith that is best for him. But some people simply can't accept this. And there are groups of religious organizations that do everything they possibly can to consider it a moral sin if one member of a family cannot convert the other. This type of thing is getting a little less common, but is more prevalent than you realize, because there is tremendous competition in the various fields of theology at the present time. Another difficulty that comes along is when sickness or unexpected disaster comes into life. This is one of the major things that we have to face, and it may arise at any moment. But most persons are completely unequipped to meet it. Now, there's no real need to be equipped to meet any of these things in the rational or scientific sense of it. In the human relationship of marriage, the most effective and important factor is affection. If we love people, if we love a person more than we love ourselves, we are comparatively safe. But the moment self-love becomes dominant, we are in very serious condition. And this, I think, is something that nearly everyone has to face. I know an example of it. I know many examples, but this one perhaps is pertinent at the moment. A man married a very lovely girl. They lived happily together for about 10 years, and all of a sudden she was stricken with paralysis. It was incurable. It was very widely spread in the body, so that she had to have perpetual care. And this perpetual care, the man who worked and paid the bills had to. He had to come home at lunchtime and take care of his wife, come home after work and take care of her, take care of the house, and raise 2 children. Someone said to him one day, "Joe, how do you do it?" He smiled and said, "Nothing to it. I love her." No problem at all. Now, this is the type of thing that's disappearing. And it's disappearing because of the fact that people are too much in love with themselves, too ambitious for themselves, and gradually escaping from the sense of community awareness. Now, this is having some interesting results. Today, probably, there is more awareness than there was 5 years ago, and a great deal more than there was 10 years ago. Why? Because world conditions are moving in with such a tremendous weight that the individual is no longer able to simply sit back and assume that he'll be a millionaire in 5 years. Maybe he will, but if he does, the taxes will be so high he can't keep it anyway. The problems of society are moving in. We are beginning to realize that we cannot separate ourselves from Europe, Asia, Africa, or Australia. That we are coming to the realization that from the standpoint of food, life, shelter, and these essentials, we are one humanity, and there's just no way of getting out of it. And we have to do something about the selfishness of individuals, which exploits the needs of human beings. So little by little, out of school, but in the job, we are beginning to realize the differences that attitudes make. That we are going to come ultimately to the point where we have to have some type of a communal existence in which, regardless of all artificial separations, we are one creation under one divine plan and absolutely required by the universe to work together cooperatively. All the rest is just going to fail and keep right on failing, and people are going to get hurt, and we're going to have multiple marriages and multiple divorces, and the things will not change until the individual begins to live according to the principles of a good life. Now, this is a real problem in education, and it's beginning to be more and more of a problem. We are discovering that we are graduating not people, but computer technicians. We are not graduating young people who can go out and in life and make a good life for themselves and each other. We are favoring competition. We are basing everything upon mental decisions. We are struggling constantly to escape from the selfishness of other people and the unreasonableness of ourselves. This cannot and must not go on, or we will destroy the most important integrities of life. If, as the result of the difficulties at the grassroots, we are going to have difficulties all the way along the line. There is no way of escaping this. Confucius pointed out that the basic unit of society was the home. As goes the home, so goes the nation. And as goes the nation, so goes the world. If we are going to have a world of broken homes, we are going to have a world of broken rules, broken laws, and broken hearts. If we do not keep the roots right, if we do not give the child the advantage of normal, cooperative affection in the first 6 or 7 years of life, the dirty work will never be cured in later years. That is the principle on which Comenius, the Moravian educator, who is regarded today as the father of the public school system, made very clear. Actually, learning begins at home. And our learning is the result of observation and reflection and affection. It is true that we have to have an education, but our character is formed before we even get into the kindergarten. And by 6 or 7 years of age, the future life of the individual is very strongly affected. As we look with people who are neurotic, who get into difficulties, who end in psychiatric wards, who go through one divorce after another, who lose one job after another, who are cured periodically of alcoholism and become the victims of various narcotic habits. Nearly all of these people have had a bad childhood. Now, a bad childhood doesn't mean that they were impoverished, but it was a childhood in which the family did not give the affection and moral support that the small child needs. The family wasn't living what it taught the child to do. The family was out doing the things it wanted to do, and if it was wealthy enough, had a nurse. But a nurse is not a mother. These things mean that due to necessity or to any other circumstance, when the family unit is distorted, disfigured, or broken up, the children and their children and their children's children will bear those scars for unknown years to come. And the scars themselves accumulating will bring down nation and civilizations. It has to start in the nursery school, the school of home. And it is in the school of home that religion is first given. Philosophy and integrities and the honesty of a child of 6 will live long after that child grows up. But without this basic root form of instruction, the future is very uncertain. So where there's a decision to make, where an individual can say, well, we could, by not having quite so many luxuries, give more actual time to a small child. The decision to take care of the child is tremendously preventive, because if that child grows up without that care, then 25 years from now there'll be another divorce on her hands. On and on it goes, continually following a very clearly cut pattern. Now, where there are no children, where the family has never been much more than an association, this problem of the child is not so considered or so valuable at a point. But there are other things that take its place. Any time that there is a broken home and it is brought to the advice or the attention of a counselor, he is going to find out various things. He will find out incompatibility. Now, incompatibility is a dissimilarity of character that is too profound, too deep, and too enduring to be changed by matrimony. Most of this incompatibility, if one person, if it is one particularly, is traceable to their childhood and the difficulties they went through. Also, it is very important to realize what happened in older days when family life was much more permanent than it is now. 100 years ago, in a smaller community, families grew up together. Each knew pretty much what the other family was. Their children played together in childhood. When they grew older, one or two of them fell in love with their former playmates, and the family sat quietly and beamed because they knew the facts of life. They knew that these families were on the same general economic level, that they had the same general integrities, that these young people knew each other from childhood, and there's every reason why the best could be hoped for. This is no longer the case. Many of these modern marriages are based on a 6 weeks acquaintance. There seems to be no way in which these people can rise above their emotions. Now, emotions are wonderful things, but emotions are things that have to be educated also. Emotions have to be trained to recognize values. They have to be built up to the point where they can appreciate what they can do to other people. And sometimes the kindest thing we could do to another person is to get out of their lives, because we are not able to take care of ourselves or them. But this is usually an indication of failure. And a divorce without marriage, without children, is largely a divorce of failure. It has gone bad because it was never properly accepted. An individual will learn to play a piano if it takes 10 years. He may learn to be an opera singer if it takes 10 years of practice. He will train for years for his job. He will do everything necessary to learn to play good golf. He will be perfectly willing to spend a great deal of time entertaining himself on television or something of this nature. Matrimony is a job for which each individual has to be trained. The basic training is in the home, and the secondary training should be education. The educational system should help young people to discover the basic values upon which a home can be built. As long as this is totally ignored, as long as there is no control, no education, no stimulation of a right nature, young people go into what should be the most important relationship in life, totally unequipped. Now, this in a civilized nation is regrettable, to say the least. And in a country that is as powerful and wealthy as this country, is a desperate disaster. There has to be and must be family educational program that doesn't wait until the situation is so bad you have to bring in a psychiatrist. There should be values by means of which we judge people, and judge the people we can live with and get along with and can hope for. Naturally, values are just. And both persons, knowing this, can work out their problems long before they become hopelessly involved. But there should be ways in which the individuals involved can so develop their own internal values so that they can be compatible. Now, this isn't necessarily a problem in which some specialized sect, some very definite program of courses is involved. The most important thing is to educate the heart, to find out whether it is possible for an individual to love. Most persons today do not even know the meaning of the word, and by the time they watch television long enough, they'll never find out, because it is more or less of a definite disaster. But without affection, each person is going to be himself to the bitter end, no matter how it hurts. Little problems are going to be magnified, minor incidents are going to be dramatized, and the individual is going to get into a position where he never forgets a hurt or a slight. If, however, there is genuine affection, it can be quite easy and simple for persons of entirely different educational backgrounds, even different racial strains, to live happily together because each one cares for the other. It is this problem of constructive caring that makes all the difference. And persons who have had difficulty in this field can, by a little thoughtfulness or a little charity of consciousness, or a little realization that underneath their difficulties there is still a mutual affection, can work it out. But it has to be worked out on one simple basis, that we care for another person more than we care for ourselves. This is perhaps the beginning of the brotherhood of humanity. For someday each person is going to have to care enough about all other persons to be a constructive factor and unit in the social structure. Until this is accomplished, the problems will never end. Now, if this division has come and the person is not able to get over the heart and hurt that brought about a divorce, then the future has to be faced. One person has said that nearly all first marriages are karmic, and there's something to be said for that. There seems to be some kind of an impact of the past upon the present that is very powerful. Perhaps another point of view on it is that the first marriage in life is certainly the one in which there is no previous experience in this life. The individual is taking on an entire change of life pattern. In any event, however, if a marriage does fail, the first thing that both persons should do, especially perhaps the person who is a victim of or feels themselves to be a victim of the separation, is to find out what it learned, what was achieved by this situation, what mistakes were allowed to grow until they became vast obstacles, what small differences of opinion led to perpetual irritation. Was the person too selfish, too demanding? Were they thoughtless? Were they concerned only with doing what they wanted to do, even though it might have been beyond the means of the other person in the family? These things have to be thought through to find out, if we can, what happened in ourselves that wrecked the pattern. If we can't find out what it is in ourselves, then we could probably contemplate a little upon the conduct of the person from whom we have been separated, and what they may have had as motives that may have been perfectly legitimate for them, but impossible for us. Very great thoughtfulness should follow a broken home. Of course, where the children are involved, a still greater thoughtfulness. And regardless of any other circumstance, both parents must be very careful that their separation does not work a hardship on their children. Everything possible must be turned to that. And I know a number of cases where accepting this responsibility with a sense of deep, reasonable consideration brought the broken home together again, and it was mended. But if that doesn't happen, then the person may be faced with the decision, should he try again? Or has this become a completely disillusioning experience, one that can never be mended, and the individual either feels that the whole world is impossible, generalizing on his own particular, or that he is simply incapable of a successful marriage. Such difficulties, however, are not real. Any person who is in desire of a home can help to have one. But he must have learned something. Both persons must have learned something from the mistake. And if they've learned something, it ends in a benefit ultimately for all concerned. If it was a mistake and separation was really indicated, then these persons are free to try to build a life again. Here all kinds of economic factors come in. Young people today are worried over the cost of marriage, particularly of alimony and child support and things of this nature. An individual is married only a few months, it may be stripped sufficiently so that another marriage is practically economically unfeasible. So to find out all of these matters carefully and thoughtfully will indicate ultimately that a second marriage can, and very often is, more successful. It is more successful because there is greater experience behind it. It is more successful because it is often preceded by a broken home for both persons involved, and therefore they have learned a great deal and have perhaps recognized enough faults in themselves which they are not going to permit to damage a future union. Under normal conditions, remarriages are sometimes more successful than an original marriage because of the greater maturity, greater experience, and perhaps a certain amount of self-censure which he's seeking constantly to find a justification. Now, philosophically speaking, we can sum the whole situation up in a very basic manner. Basically, as according to Scripture and according to nature, the marriage ceremony is a sanctification of the perpetuation of the race. It is the union of two human beings to perpetuate the ages, to make sure there are futures for all the world, and also that we are fulfilling a natural urge, one of which must be fulfilled. It is an urge that is planted in the human being by the laws of nature, by the rules of nature, by the most profound and lasting relationships of nature, and must never be taken as something trivial, something impermanent, something secondary in value and significance. Therefore, any system which in one way or another depreciates marriage and depreciates permanent relationships between people is dangerous to the common good. The idea of just drifting along without responsibility may favor the selfishness in the person, and there are many who are following that course today. But the individual who runs away from a potential responsibility that is reasonable and proper is only cheating himself. The whole structure of nature for the human being is based upon the home, based upon permanent values helping each generation to grow. Progress is not in the laboratory primarily, or in the courts of law, nor in the wheels of industry, nor in bank accounts and investments. Progress is in terms of human integrities, and the custodian of basic integrities is always the home unit. This is more important than wealth or fame or distinction. It is more important than the gratification of any appetites or dissipations that we may have. Because actually, this process of perpetuating humanity is the way in which progress is achieved. If the child is wiser than the father, if in time going by each child learns something about the future and becomes a properly matured person capable of becoming a parent, this type of thing is progress. It is the thing that we are all trying for. But we are trying to do it politically, and the politicians had bad childhoods. We are trying to do it industrially, and the industrialists are selfish and self-centered. We are trying to do it religiously, and theology is for the most part in conflict with itself, and therefore unable to give us a united support. It is true that religion is never divided. There are 72 names of God, but there is only one God. There are many names for love, but there is only one love that is real, and that is the one that suffereth long and is kind. All the agitations, all the drama, all the emotional falderall is of no basic significance except that it delays world peace, it delays social equalities, and it delays the progress of a proper industrial and economic structure. All of these things are damaged by the individual who is unwilling to grow up, but insists upon being a perpetual adolescent with nothing on their mind but themselves. Consequently, if we are willing to think in terms of a proper home, then we should start with our own and make sure that it's as good as we can make it. And if it is not as good as we can make it, then it is our problem to find out whether we love someone else more than we love ourselves. If we do, the home will endure. If it does not endure because of factors completely beyond our control, then we must learn the result of either some deficiency in our own insight or some inability of the other person to express themselves. Then we have to call it off. But never with bitterness. Always grateful for an experience even if it was hard. Always glad we have gone through something and come out of it better people. Always grateful to nature for the laws which help to build a family and home. And grateful to God for the power that has been bestowed in us by which we may become godlike in the sense of serving others with no thought of ourselves. All of these things should be part of the education of children. The child should grow up realizing that it has two lives to live. One to make a living physically, and the other to make a life internally. And when one is sacrificed to the other, there is always difficulty. But nature, which likes variety, and does not believe in an individual going for 60 years in one job in order to end up manager of the business. Nature doesn't like that. That is something that man does because he is selfish and desirous of getting every possible advantage he can industrially and economically. What is actually the real problem in this whole situation is that the individual, in all of the relationships of life, has got to learn that there is a basic human relationship. It is a phase of what we call love. Jesus says, "Love ye one another." And if we really loved one another, the divorce rate would drop about 90%. But when we keep on loving ourselves best, it stays the way it is. And if it breaks because of another person that we cannot prevent, this does not mean that we have to hate them. We can continue to love them enough to let them go their way and do the thing that they feel is right. It's very much like children. A broken home is like children leaving home. It has to happen sometimes. But it must always happen with blessing and with love and affection and the best of good wishes for the future. These things maybe will seem a little too excessive when you're in the middle of a bad argument, but unless we have this realization in ourselves, it is not the divorce that damages us most. It is our own attitude toward it. If the divorce is a tragedy from which we will never survive, and this divorce is due entirely to another unreasonable and impossible person, then the psychotic consequence goes into various frustrations and neuroses and very often ends in psychosis. We cannot damage ourselves by hating anybody. We can't afford it. We can't damage ourselves by blaming other people for all of our troubles. We most succeed in mental health, emotional health, and spiritual integrity when we stand firmly for our principles, do the best we can, be as kind as we know, and as unselfish as possible. These are the assets, but they're the very things that young people today are taught not to have. Because if they have those things, they will never be rich. But it is better, perhaps, to lose all that we have in the world than it is to lose our own soul. And the victory of soul over circumstance is the victory of love over every disaster, every problem, every mysterious incident. Love God, and we will be strong. Love people, and gradually we will come to understand them. Love truth, and we can have it someday. Love all these good things. Love the little birds and the animals and the flowers and the sunset. Let love lead all things. And those who have learned to love life as it is will be able to love some other person of that life which they have selected to go with them. It is all the victory of unselfishness. Love is truly returned and perfected in the simple thing, that it is perfected in loving and not in being loved. St. Francis de Assisi made this point very clearly. The great thing is not that somebody else loves us. The great thing is that we love others for what they are and as they are, and serve them forever in the name of God and humanity. If we keep these points more or less in mind, I think it'll help us to get a message out of a divorce and help us to build a new home which is going to go on, and also to protect young people in a broken home who must learn to understand. And they cannot understand unless some grown-up person tells them, teaches them, helps them, shows them the way. In this critical time, we have to face what happens. But with the facing of things that happen, we must never lose sight of the basic purpose for life, and that is the fulfillment of the release of our own divinity. And that is proven by one thing. We grow to the degree that love matures. We shrink to the degree that love is defeated in us. We grow by love and by striving toward not only a love of God, but in the name of the love of God, love of each other. Love can cure most maladies of the human mind, but we have to really have it. And I think wisdom, philosophy, mysticism, faith of all kinds, art, music, all beautiful things help love to grow. All carelessness and thoughtlessness, all deformities of attitudes, shrinks that power in ourselves which should enable us to fulfill the 70, 80, 90 years that we live here graciously and purposefully, so that we can truly leave this world better than when we came to it. If we keep this in mind, I think it'll all work out. Thank you very much. society or our own inner conscience. To avoid or evade these responsibilities of decision, we have to call upon resources. What resources does the average person of today, especially the younger person, have to fall back on in an emotional or mental emergency? What background have we built to maintain life, to maintain those things and values which make life significant, meaningful, useful, and practical? Well, most young people today have not had training in what Comenius called the mother school. The mother, in turn, is in a state of personal emotional tension and confusion. The inside of the person, dominated by environmental pressures, develops fatigues and gradually lowers the level of dispositional controls. So the family today is made up very largely of tired, tense, worried, frightened people. And children coming into this environment gain very little of basic integrities. In many homes, of course, efforts are definitely made to take care of the moral life of the small child. Perhaps every effort is made to indoctrinate them with the religious generalities of the family. But if the child sees that the parents can't make it and are unable to live their own teaching, it is very difficult to assure the young person that the pattern is secure. It is not. Now, in addition to the generalities of the matter, we have passed through tremendous insecurities. Now, the world has always had them, and there has to be a reason why. There has to be a reason why, in the last 3,000 or 4,000 years, we have had over 8,000 large and small wars. Now, they are all the way from small attacks and defenses in the state. Now, the church today is simply a term which we can apply to the problems of the inner life of the individual. And the state applies to his external and environmental difficulties. Therefore, we all live on a two-level code. A code from the outside which forces decisions upon us, and a code from the inside which is supposed to provide us with ideals and incentives by means of which we can bear with dignity the problems of the outside world. Many people are not equipped for this, and it is difficult and unhappy to say that in the last 50 years the strength of the inner code has diminished for most people. We are no longer dominated by what might be termed traditional rules, nor is the church strong enough to demand allegiance to various moral codes which have been presented to the world over the period of thousands of years. The individual, trying to adjust to the environment, sacrifices the integrities of his inner life. And if he tries to live according to the inner life, he runs into confusion and conflict in the environmental world. So we are all torn between ideals and what we like to think of as realities. Realities, however, are merely temporary, passing conditions of society. But realities go on forever. Thus we have to really consider what happens to people. Why is it that the divorce rate is increasing, and that laws and rules are being made every day which cater primarily to escape mechanisms? We do not wish to be forced into a head-on collision with either society. Well, I heard that a professor in one of our large universities asked a member of the junior class to tell him the principal cause of divorce. And with that wisdom, which is far beyond his years, the young man answered, marriage. And you really can't say he wasn't just exactly right. But I'm sure it's not the answer that was expected. Actually, if we look upon life for what it really is, a training school, a place where we're supposed to learn something, then when great groups of people, nations, do not learn, they are in trouble. When individuals do not learn, their difficulties multiply. And of all difficulties for human beings, human relationships are the most complex and difficult. We probably do not always realize this and have a kind of optimism that we can go through a complete lifetime in comparative ease. Well, a few make it. But for the majority, life becomes a series of decisions. Not that they are in themselves tragic, though they are difficult, but they are decisions that call upon resources within ourselves, resources that we do not like to be forced to use. We do not like to accept pain, sorrow, loss, separation, infidelity, or any of these relationships of life which test the caliber of individuals. Also, we are divided in our allegiances always by that great separation which was for thousands of years called the church and the jungle, to the tremendous tragedies of the present century. These conflicts appear to be the work of some great evil force, but actually they represent the fact that up to the present time, human society has never been able to keep the rules which would not make conflict necessary, or inevitable if not necessary. Actually, the world as it is not being offended or destroyed by some terrible force in space. It is simply constantly building patterns. And these patterns are so deficient that they fall apart every so many years or centuries into a great catastrophe. The answer, of course, is that we must face these things until we are willing to make the necessary changes in our own conduct. Now, many people, of course, are not aware that they can make such changes. But there is constant indoctrination in that direction. We are warned and assured that if we take the right steps, live correctly, these problems will solve themselves. But for some reason, the problems are not solved because, for some other reason, we are not living correctly. What is the matter with society in the level of family and home life? It is being battered to pieces by ambition. It is being undermined by competition. And it is also being demoralized by luxury. Someone asked a Greek philosopher if he wished to curse a man, what would he say? And the old philosopher thought for a while. Then he said, if that was to come to me, I would say to that man, may your son live in luxury. He says, that is the worst thing I can think of. Well, we got a lot of sons living in luxury these days, and many more that want to. But the fact of the matter is that the individuals and the collective's difficulties arise from ambition, selfishness, competition, and lack of discipline. Our ancestors had more discipline because life was more simple. And another factor that controlled things largely until the middle or later part of the 19th century was the power of religion. In Europe during the Middle Ages and early modern times, the religious situation was so tight that there could be very little deviation from it, except among a certain group that was regarded as impossible anyway. The same is true in this country. Our ancestors had a much more complete religious environment. They believed in it, they lived according to it to the best of their abilities, and they also rejected those who failed to conform. Now, conformity to theology is a matter today in which more and more people are objecting. But in those days when no one did object successfully, the religious background formed a kind of support, a framework, a basis upon which human society could function. The golden rules were respected. The 10 Commandments were obeyed as much as possible. And all the various elements of human relationships were strongly influenced by various religious moralities, especially in this country, the morality of Christianity. So we had certain strengths and also certain tendencies for those who tried to break away to be forced back by the environment in which they lived. They could not escape without losing the respect of their associates. Today all this has changed. But in the process of changing, we have lost necessary values